Elena stood in the grocery aisle, clutching a single loaf of bread like it was the only thing keeping her grounded in a world that had turned its back on her, her eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed linoleum floor to avoid the predatory gaze of the store manager, Mr. Holloway. For 6 long, grueling months, Holloway had made it his personal mission to make her life a living hell, constantly mocking her for her faded, second-hand clothes and the quiet, almost invisible way she moved through the store. He was a man who thrived on the smallest crumbs of power, often cornering her in the break room just to remind her that a washed-up nurse with a revoked license and a ruined reputation was lucky to even be scrubbing the grease off his floors for minimum wage. Elena never fought back, not because she lacked spirit, but because she was carrying the crushing weight of a tragedy from 2 years ago, a fatal surgical mistake she hadn't actually committed but had taken the full legal and professional blame for just to protect a younger colleague who had a whole life ahead of her. Her heart felt like a heavy, cold stone in her chest, filled with the lingering sadness of a lost career she had loved and the suffocating helplessness of being at the mercy of an arrogant, untouchable man who saw her as nothing more than dirt under his expensive shoes. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the store was unusually crowded, humming with the sound of rolling carts and distant chatter, while Mr. Holloway was busy fawning over a group of wealthy corporate investors, laughing too loudly at their jokes and making sure everyone in the building knew he was the undisputed king of his little empire. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted as if the air had been sucked out of the room, and a tall, elderly man in a simple but impeccably pressed gray suit stumbled near the dairy section, his breath coming in ragged, terrifying gasps as he reached out for a shelf that wasn't there. Before anyone could react, he collapsed heavily to the cold tile floor with a sickening thud that seemed to echo through the entire building, and panic erupted instantly among the shoppers. Customers gasped and pulled their children away, some began to cry, and Mr. Holloway stood frozen like a statue, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray as he realized a medical emergency in his store would be a public relations nightmare he wasn't prepared to handle. He started shouting useless orders at his teenage staff to call an ambulance, his voice cracking with fear, but he didn't take a single step forward to help the dying man because he was too afraid of the legal liability and too terrified of the raw, messy reality of death happening right in front of his polished shoes. Elena felt a familiar, long-dormant spark ignite deep in her chest, a surge of adrenaline that pushed aside the exhaustion and the shame, and the quiet hope she had buried under layers of grief surged to the surface with a force that surprised her. She dropped her bread without a second thought and moved toward the fallen man, her steps not frantic but purposeful and steady, the movements of a professional who had walked the line between life and death 1,000 times before. As she reached the man, Holloway suddenly snapped out of his trance and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her skin as he hissed at her to get back to her work and not to touch the customer, warning her with a sneer that she would be fired and sued if she messed this up or made the situation worse. Elena didn't even blink or look at his face, she simply and firmly shook his hand off her arm with a strength that made him stumble back in shock, and she knelt beside the man whose eyes were already rolling back into his head, his pulse feeling thready and dangerously weak under her fingertips. The entire world around her seemed to vanish into a blur of gray noise. The years of insults, the biting poverty, and the crushing shame of her downfall didn't matter anymore because in this moment, she wasn't a janitor, she was a nurse. She checked his airway with practiced efficiency and began chest compressions, her hands moving with a rhythmic, calculated strength that came from years of saving lives in the emergency room. The crowd gathered in a wide, hushed circle, their whispers filling the air like the buzzing of bees, and while Mr. Holloway kept muttering about lawsuits and calling the police to have her removed, Elena didn't hear a word he said. She leaned down close to the man's ear, noticing a small, silver pin on his lapel, a distinguished military cross that spoke of battles fought and sacrifices made, and she leaned in and whispered with a voice like a prayer, "Hold on, soldier, your unit is waiting for you, do not give up now." For 10 grueling, heart-pounding minutes, Elena fought a private war against death right there on the supermarket floor, her muscles screaming with fatigue and her sweat dripping onto the tile, but her soul was on fire with a sense of purpose she thought she had lost forever. Just as the distant, wailing sirens of the ambulance finally began to grow louder in the street outside, the man took a sharp, gasping breath that sounded like a miracle, and his eyes fluttered open, meeting Elena's calm, steady gaze with an intensity that felt like a silent conversation. He couldn't speak through his pain, but he reached out and squeezed her hand with a surprising, desperate strength, a silent acknowledgement of the woman who had pulled him back from the edge of the abyss. When the paramedics finally rushed through the automatic doors with their equipment, Elena quietly stood up and stepped back into the shadows. She didn't wait for praise, she didn't look for a reward, and she didn't try to explain herself to the crowd. She simply walked back to her forgotten mop bucket in the corner, her face as expressionless and humble as it had been for months, while Mr. Holloway was already positioning himself in front of a local news crew that had arrived on the scene. He began shamelessly claiming to the cameras that he had personally coordinated the rescue effort, that he had kept the crowd calm and ensured the victim received immediate care under his expert supervision. He looked over his shoulder and saw Elena standing there, and he pointed aggressively toward the dark back room, telling her to disappear into the warehouse before she ruined his shot and reminded the world that he employed such a pathetic, broken woman. Elena went without a word, spending the next 2 days in a blur of bone-deep exhaustion and quiet reflection, waiting for the inevitable moment when Holloway would find a petty reason to finally let her go for good. That moment arrived on Thursday morning when Holloway called her into his glass-walled office, a smug, triumphant grin plastered across his face as he sat behind his desk. He told her with cold satisfaction that her services were no longer required because she had fundamentally violated company policy by touching a customer without authorization, and he felt completely untouchable, basking in the lingering glow of the positive media attention he had stolen from her. But just as he reached for her final, meager paycheck to toss it across the desk, the heavy oak door to his office swung open without a single knock, and a group of formidable men in dark, tailored suits stepped inside, followed by the elderly man from the store. He wasn't wearing a simple gray suit anymore, he was dressed in full, formal military attire, the rows of medals and the bright stars on his shoulders gleaming like fire under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. This was General Marcus Thorne, a man whose name was whispered in the halls of the Pentagon and whose influence reached the very highest levels of the government and international affairs. Holloway's jaw literally dropped, and he stood up so fast his expensive leather chair toppled over backward with a loud crash, and he started stammering, trying to welcome the general and take credit for the rescue all over again with a shaky, desperate voice. The general didn't even acknowledge Holloway's existence, he didn't even look at the man's outstretched hand. Instead, he walked straight past the desk to Elena, who was standing quietly and bravely in the corner of the room. He took her small, rough hands in both of his own, his eyes misty with a profound, heartfelt gratitude that no metal could ever convey, and he told her that he had spent the last 48 hours using every resource at his disposal to find the woman who had called him a soldier when he was drifting into the dark. He told her he knew everything about her past, he knew the truth about the hospital incident, and he knew about the selfless sacrifice she had made for a colleague who didn't deserve it. He informed her right then and there that he had already personally spoken to the National Medical Board, and her nursing license was being reinstated immediately with a full, public apology from the state. Then, the general finally turned his gaze toward Holloway, and his voice became like cold, sharpened iron as he told the manager that a man who lacks the basic human soul to help a dying person, and who tries to destroy the one person who did, is fundamentally unfit to lead even a grocery store. Within less than an hour, the corporate owners of the entire store chain, who happened to be personal friends and former subordinates of the general, arrived in a flurry of black cars to personally escort a sobbing, ruined Holloway out of the building. Elena walked out of those sliding glass doors for the last time, stepping into the bright, warm sunlight with her head held high, no longer a forgotten cleaning lady, but a respected healer whose life had been restored by the very man she refused to let die. Justice had finally arrived, not with a loud shout of vengeance, but with the quiet, unstoppable strength of a woman who had the patience to wait for the truth to set her free.